Well, hello, and welcome to this week's ASMP Week in Review. This is episode 2. My name's Thomas Madry. I'm ASMP's General Counsel and Head of National Content and Education, and we have some exciting stories for you this week. So I want to start by reminding you that this is the show where each week we look at 3 to 5 stories that have been in the news related to visual creation, related to photography. Sometimes they'll have a legal bent, sometimes they'll just be for fun, sometimes they'll be editorials and commentary. And I'm going to give you my thoughts on them, bring you the news, let you know what's going on, and hopefully you'll pick something up. Now, I want to particularly welcome and thank PetaPixel. The stories that we source each week are from PetaPixel. And you guys know that they are one of the best sources online to get the information that you need up to date. They update so many stories each day. I don't know how they do it. It's pretty incredible. We are really proud to be partnered with them for ASMP's Week in Review. And each time we look at a story, you're going to see a link. That link will take you to the PetaPixel story where you can get more information. But of course, to get the absolute maximum out of this program, you'll head over to the ASMP Academy. It's academy.asmp.org. And at the ASMP Academy, on the page that is ASMP Week in Review, you're going to see links to the stories, the full video that you're watching now, as well as a number of other links to anything that I talk about that's in there. We'll try to get that all up at the ASMP Academy. If you're not an ASMP member, we really want you to be an ASMP member. ASMP is a 76-year-old organization that's focused on creators' rights, focused on photography, filmmakers, all visual creators. And we get out there and we advocate for things like copyright protection and make sure that contracts and business topics are covered. And at the ASMP Academy, you can find hours and hours and hours of courses and classes on copyright, on contracts, the cost of doing business. We have classes coming up on NFTs. We have classes coming up on how to find the right attorney. Lots of exciting stuff in the next few months and as the year turns. A lot of exciting stuff that I can't quite announce yet, but I'm really looking forward to it. But without any further ado, let's get into what we are talking about today. We are going to cover 4 stories that I read on PetaPixel in the last week that I thought were particularly interesting, all for a variety of reasons. The first story is about BJ Novak. And if that name sounds familiar, it's because he's one of the writers and producers on The Office. Very talented, very funny individual. And he has become an unwitting, unknowing stock model, and we're going to talk about that. There's an article posted, an editorial about eye autofocus tracking that is common now in many cameras, and especially in mirrorless cameras. And there was a little bit of a controversial article that I read over on PetaPixel, and I had some thoughts on it. I had some commentary on it, so we're going to dig into that a little bit. One article that I found truly interesting was, oddly enough, about photographs of fairies. And the reason this was interesting is because the images that are at issue, and we're going to look at some of them, the images that are at issue were taken at a time in the history of photography where society was still trying to figure out what was real and what wasn't real. Also, in the broader context of society, there was a lot of upheaval and a lot of things going on. And in this situation, there were some photographs that some young women took that depicted themselves and fairies. And Sir Arthur Conan Doyle of Sherlock Holmes fame saw these images and believed that these were actual images of fairies and spent quite a few hours writing about this. And we're going to look at some of the images and then find out what ultimately happened in this story. And then finally, we're going to wrap up today by looking at a piece of news that just came out in the last few days about Instagram and Instagram beginning to offer a creators account, a creators fund, in the same way that some other social media platforms do, and offering subscriptions. That's going to be a new way to monetize creators' works on Instagram. Now, is this going to apply to everyone? No, because Instagram has really made clear that they are taking the platform away from photo sharing and into some other areas, and we're going to discuss that as well. So let's jump in. You know, as I mentioned, BJ Novak, best known for acting in, writing, directing, producing The Office. And I have very much enjoyed rewatching some of the episodes of The Office, the super fan episodes with the extended cut lately. But over the past several years, BJ Novak realized that his face has appeared on products all around the world. As an example, here is a Chinese manufacturer, a hair trimming product, and there is BJ. And if you go to the PetaPixel article, you can see 3 or 4 others where he's featured as a model in what seems to be a stock photo. And this raises some interesting questions about copyright and about ownership, and also about rights of publicity, right? Rights of publicity, which is something totally separate from copyright. You know, one thing that is brought up in the article is this idea of public domain and what public domain is. Now, when I look at this story, I'm thinking not as much about copyright and public domain as I am about rights of publicity, but let's take a second and talk about public domain. You know, in the US, under US copyright law, the copyright in a photograph lasts for the creator's life plus 70 years. And there is no renewal of copyright anymore. There used to be in some of the copyright acts before 1976. There was a way to renew copyright, that kind of thing. But now you get the term of copyright, the creator's life plus 70 years. Now, if you're a business and in certain situations, work for hire situations, it could be 95 years or 120 years based on publication. For more on that, you can go watch Copyright Essentials over in the ASMP Academy, which will talk about copyright term in a lot more detail than I just did. And at the end of the term of copyright, so at the end of the creator's life plus 70 years, the image goes into the public domain. And the public domain is where anyone can use the work, anyone can use the formally copyrighted work for whatever they want to use it for, right? Now, that is in copyright law. Copyright law is federal law, right? There are some other laws that are implicated here. And the law that I want you to be thinking about is this idea of right of publicity. Jeff Sedlick is an expert in many photographic arenas, and in a CNN article that I've also linked to on the Academy page, Jeff talks about rights of publicity. In 24 states, the person in the photo may have a right of publicity which prevents the unauthorized commercial use of someone's name or likeness. That protects the person if their photo is used to appear as if they're endorsing something. So that is a separate issue, and you notice it starts with in 24 states. And that's because, unlike copyright, rights of publicity are state rights. So there's a patchwork of rules all around the country when it comes to the rights that someone has in their work. So this is an interesting question, right? So we have a picture here. We have copyright implications, because the copyright implications are someone took this picture, someone owns this picture. And by the way, BJ Novak does not own the copyright to this image, most likely. Just because you're the subject of an image doesn't mean you own the copyright. In fact, it doesn't mean at all that you own the copyright. But what we're looking at here is that whoever does own the copyright could have a colorable case of infringement if they didn't permit this company to use the image on their packaging. Now that is totally separate from the idea of the right of publicity, which is a right that is held not by the photographer, but by B.J. Novak himself. And different states and different rules talk about sometimes celebrities have different rules than regular people. And you might have heard recently, especially in the NCAA context, talking about name, image, and likeness, right? And this is kind of in the same world that we're talking about with right of publicity. So the right of publicity question here is this indicating that B.J. Novak is endorsing this product, right? And I think it's probably fair to say that yes, a reasonable person could look at this and say that, oh, okay, this must be the boutique rechargeable electric hair clipper that B.J. Novak uses himself. So there are a number of different legal issues that are coming into play. Now, when Novak saw this, and you can go to Novak's Instagram, we've put a link to that there on the Academy page. When Novak saw this, he said, "I am too amused to do anything about it," the actor writes in his Instagram story. And like I said, he's put a number of these into his Instagram story entitled Modeling. So one story, one image on a product, it's actually many different products that he appears to be endorsing across the world. Realize that there are different levels of rights. And there are different arenas of rights. There's federal rights, and there's state rights, and copyrights, and rights of privacy, and rights of publicity. These are all separate things. Now, as a quick aside, when we talk about things like talent releases and model releases, we're really talking about rights of publicity, right? We're really talking about someone giving up their right or allowing you to use the image in ways that allows you to use their likeness exactly like this. If there were a signed model release that allowed this image to be used in this way, then there wouldn't be a legal issue, presuming copyright and everything else was taken care of. But a model release really has not much to do with copyright. That is related to the rights that the talent has, the rights that the model has. All right. So when I look for articles for this program, I just read through and I see which ones catch my eye, no pun intended. And this one did catch my eye because when I read the title, I said, okay, that's a bit of a hot take. And then I got into the meat of the article by Joshua Holko, and I had a smile on my face, and I disagreed with some things, and I agreed with other things. And let me just take a second, because I don't often talk about it, and certainly, and I haven't talked about it on this program, but prior to attending law school, I was a commercial photographer and a fine art photographer for a little over a decade. And that was my first career. And so in particular, I was a nature and wildlife photographer. I led workshops all over the world and got to experience some incredible places. And it's still certainly a passion of mine. But this article is written from the perspective of a sports photographer, nature and wildlife photographer as well. And so I had some particular interest in what Joshua was writing. Now, to his credit, right at the very beginning, he says that this article is bound to stir up a little bit of controversy. And I think it may, right? So the upshot of the article is that the new, and new I mean within the last decade, and continued refinement of eye autofocus tracking is something that is primarily geared towards helping non-professional photographers get better results. And of course, the title saying it isn't really for pro photographers is a bit, maybe a bit inflammatory. But Joshua came up with some pretty good arguments about this, and he talks about that professionals put in the hours and they have a lot of experience with their equipment. He says, In particular, professional sports and wildlife photographers are skilled at capturing sharp images with narrow depth of field with a telephoto lens. It is what we do for a living daily. We know how to place the autofocus point on the eye of the moving subject and how to move the AF points around the frame on the fly to get the best possible results. And I think, obviously, there's a lot of truth to that. So many photographers, when I started taking pictures, and of course, shooting film like many of us did, and you would move with the little thumb pad in the back there. You would move around your 5 or 8 or 10 autofocus points, sometimes fewer, and it would require muscle memory. It would require skill. It would require a lot. And it didn't matter what your eye did because your eye was not connected to the autofocus system. Of course, that's changed, especially in the new crop and mirrorless cameras, where eye autofocus tracking has become almost ubiquitous, but also pretty good. Now, in this article, Joshua argues that, look, pros don't need this because pros already have the experience. And they have the time that they've put in with their equipment, and they know how to get the same results that something like eye autofocus tracking would get you. Now, I'll give you some of my opinions at the end, but I want to go over a few other interesting quotes from this article, which I absolutely encourage you to go read. So Joshua says, "The harsh reality is professional photographers who quibble over the price of camera equipment are likely not really in full-time business." Well, I think that a lot of people might read that and think that's not an accurate sentiment. But in the context of what Joshua was writing, he was saying, look, for a professional, a camera is a tool like any other tool is to any other professional, and that there's absolutely a cost associated with the tools that you use, but you want to use the right tool for the right job. And I think that is an absolutely on-point analysis, that not every camera is designed to, and not every camera will suit the photography style of each photographer. The longer you spend as a professional, the more you hone and refine the type of equipment, the type of gear that fits the type of work that you do. There are certain cases as a landscape photographer where I would pull out my 4x5 camera, and then there were certain cases when I was photographing whales out on the ocean where that would be just a ridiculous tool. Joshua also talks about why his opinion about eye autofocus tracking isn't for pro photographers, and then he talks about who it might be for. And I found this really, really interesting, and something that I definitely wanted to touch on. In other words, Joshua says, eye autofocus in a mirrorless camera doesn't offer us any real benefit over our innate skills. Sure, it might mean a slightly better hit rate, but ultimately we can focus where we want it, when we want it, without this technology. We've been doing so since the early film days. What eye autofocus technology does is it takes the skill set of a professional photographer, automate it, and makes it available to everyone else to take advantage of. And that is a fantastic capability. So I agree with some of that. But I'll take a broader view on the philosophical point because it's one that I and many of us have heard over and over throughout the years, especially during the transition of film to digital. And there will always be a contingent of photographers who are not only comfortable, but most comfortable with using the technology that was around as they were coming up. That isn't to say that photographers who have been around for a little while don't adapt to new technologies, but it is to say they might be slightly more reticent to do so than others, especially non-professionals. And the argument here is one that resonated with me when we think about mobile photography and iPhone photography. And that is that the features that we're seeing cameras have, and whether we talk about a camera as a mirrorless camera, a DSLR camera, or an iPhone or a mobile camera, we're seeing technology in cameras that allow non-professionals to emulate and match certain skills that in the past professionals were the only ones that had, because they were based on practice and hours that you had put in behind the lens. And there is this tension, I would say, and we see this in all photographers. There's this tension that goes from one area to another when we look at the democratization of what should be the role of a non-professional versus a professional. And I think that in the last 10, 15 years, what we've really seen is that equipment and cameras do not change the way that a professional photographer sees. It changes the way that non-professional photographers are able to achieve certain technical ends, right? So as we're looking at Joshua's article, it reminded me of so many different arguments and disagreements photographers may have had over the last 20 years and before that, because I think many of us can remember a time when autofocus was not something that was reliable or even existed. And those professionals who had spent decades honing the ability to nail focus when the only option was manual focus, I think this dichotomy, this tension will exist at each new transition period. Now, I will say Joshua ends up in the article concluding that professionals will move to mirrorless cameras. The last crop of truly high-end DSLRs are probably the ones that have just been announced and are coming out now, and that mirrorless cameras are the future. But he notes that the change won't be because they have to move over. It'll be because they want to move over, and that is the simple end of that. I encourage you to go read the article. I think it's excellently written and a good argument for the nature of professional and non-professional photographers. So now let's talk about a story that I found fascinating. I had never heard of. I think that there is a lot of interesting little elements to this. And this is, we'll call it Cottingley Fairies, the photo hoax that fooled Kodak and Arthur Conan Doyle. Very long article, definitely deserves far more credit than I am giving it in this short recording. So if you look at the images on the right, you'll see that young women took photographs with their camera that included fairies and said, look, these were real fairies. These are actually, this is actually as we took them. Now, we all come from a time in society where it's not only not uncommon to have a critical analysis of photos, but it's required in the post-Photoshop world that we live in. And so in this article, it talks about these fairies that are in the forest. There are fairies in the forest, and with the use of Francis's Uncle Arthur's camera, the two could prove it. Armed with his W. Butcher and Sons quarter-plate Midge camera, by the way, I put a link to that on the Academy page, Elise and Francis set off into the woods to capture these images of fairies in the forest. And once these were put out into the world, they found a number of people who believed that these were fairies in the forest. Arthur Conan Doyle being one of the most prominent. So Doyle believed that these were authentic images, and he sought further confirmation of this, going so far as to reach out to Kodak for the best analysis possible. And of course, back in the late 1800s, Kodak was the authority for anything photography related. By the way, last week in ASMP's Week in Review episode 1, we talked about how the Kodak Brownie changed privacy rights, and another Kodak story, another historical story that is probably worth checking out. The images were pored over by the company's expert technicians, and while they concurred with a prior opinion that there was a lot going on here, they did not certify the authenticity. They refused to say that these were authentic. Now, refuse to certify the authenticity is different than saying, hey, these are just flat out fake, right? And so Arthur Conan Doyle continued along believing that these were accurate. And in fact, he said, when our fairies are admitted, other psychic phenomena will find more ready acceptance. So I found it really interesting in this article. The author, Matt Williams, went through and talked about the things that were happening in society at the time, and the personal items that may have led Arthur Conan Doyle and others to believe that these images were authentic. But of course, at the end of the day, the truth will out. And it was not until 1983, Matt Williams writes, that they finally came clean, they being the photographers, the young women. Though even then, Francis claimed one photograph, their fifth, had been entirely real. The girls had merely used simple paper cutouts traced, repurposed, or redrawn from the images of books and magazines they had access to. So, at the end of the day, these were not actual depictions of fairies in the forest. Now, when I read this, it immediately made me think of a very famous situation that occurred around the same time period, a little bit earlier in the 1870s, with a photographer, Edward Muybridge, right? Muybridge. And Muybridge did something incredible, and it always makes me think of a time before photography. And so let's look at something. This is a little aside. I won't often do this, but let's take a look at a couple things here. So Edward Muybridge was the first person to show that when a horse gallops, all 4 feet are off the ground at once. And he showed this, I think, in 1873, and then later on, he repeated this in a couple of different scenarios, each time getting more and more refined and more complex. I put a lot of links about this story over on the Academy page, so definitely go and check this out, because this is always an important piece in the history of photography to me. Imagine a time in the history of the world where it was unclear and there was no way to prove that when a horse galloped, all 4 feet were off the ground. Now, I say there was no way to prove. Maybe what I should say is that no one had proven it, or proven it in a way that had widespread acceptance. I don't want to categorically say that there was no way to prove something. But in my mind, prior to 1870, to the beginning of human history, people were unable to determine the answer to this simple question. When a horse gallops, are all 4 feet off the ground? And then in 1870, which in the history of the world is not that long ago, right? Edward Muybridge came out, did this study, and showed empirically that yes, that is the case. It's one of these issues that when I think of how photography changes the world, when I think of all the things that couldn't have been seen before photography was invented. It's one of those humbling things about photography. When I was in photography school and after in my career, I did a lot of work with hospitals and labs looking at microscope images and images of slides of human anatomy and crystals and insects and everything else. None of those images were possible. None of the images of the stars, none of the images of so many things that we think are iconic were possible before the 1860s, 1850s, when photography came into being. And Matt Williams' article about Sir Arthur Conan Doyle made me think about this and made me think about Edward Bridge. And I definitely, if you're not entirely familiar with this story, I would go read about it. There were challenges and there was money involved, and it felt very, very late 1800s to me, and I find it totally fascinating. Well, I want to end today by talking about Instagram and a story that just came out in the last few days by their editor-in-chief, Jaron Schneider, who put together this story about how Instagram is nearing the launch of paid creator subscriptions. So backing up a little bit, in spring of 2021, there was a report by the publication The Information that said that Instagram was exploring the possibility of adding subscriptions to its system that would allow content creators on the platform to offer paid memberships to followers. Now, we see this in other contexts, right? In other social media platforms and other media platforms, we see the ability for creators to monetize what they're creating through the use of subscriptions. Throughout this year, later in the summer, reverse engineer expert Alessandro Paluzzi discovered the feature as a work in progress in the Instagram app, and that initial developments he found showed that subscribers would get a special member badge and gain access to exclusive live videos. Now, some creators are absolutely going to benefit, but obviously we have to think about the types of creators that are monetizing their work primarily on social media platforms like Instagram. Jaron writes in his article, the addition of subscriptions would prove to be a massive boon for some creators and would create a kind of revenue sharing model that would directly pay content creators for engaging with specific users on Instagram. But I want you to remember what Instagram's CEO, Adam Mosseri, said in this year, in 2021. He said publicly that Instagram is moving away from being a photo sharing platform and will focus more on video and shopping moving forward. Now, for so many photographers, Instagram is their de facto portfolio. You will send people to your Instagram page if you want them to find out about what you do and if you want them to hire you. There's a couple levels to this that I find really interesting. One is, what happens with Instagram over the next few years is going to be really interesting to watch. Because when you have a CEO coming out and saying that you're moving away from being a photo sharing platform, which obviously is what Instagram was centered around, and moving into video and shopping, which frankly I don't quite know exactly what that means, but that change is a big change. It starts to make Instagram look a little more like another video-based platform, TikTok, right? And TikTok is wildly successful in a number of different areas, and I know that Instagram has looked at that. We work and we have members at ASMP who are YouTube creators, who are TikTok creators, who are Instagram creators, and I think that Instagram offering a way to monetize creators' works is generally positive. It's my view that the more opportunity creators have to make money off of what they create, the better. I think that's probably a guiding ethos of ASMP in general. The question, though, becomes which creators will benefit? Which creators will benefit from such an arrangement? Now, in the image on the right, you can see this is from one of the reverse engineered screenshots. And by the way, on the Academy page, you get links to all these Twitter accounts and where all these screenshots came from. You'll see that there are in-app purchases that are in development for things like badges and things like subscriptions. This is a model that I think many social media platforms will end up utilizing. I think that creators, if you're on the leading edge of this, you have an opportunity to utilize this as a revenue stream. I would not recommend to creators to look down at something like this and think that this isn't relevant for the type of work that you do. Now, some types of work will inure more significantly with this type of platform. But anytime creators are finding new ways to monetize their work, I think it is a positive thing. What I think is a negative thing is the unknown that comes from Adam Mosseri when he talks about Instagram moving away from photos and over to video. That makes me wonder who is going to fill the vacuum and what that is going to look like, and how still photographers can monetize their works as well. Interesting questions that I think as the months and years unfold will be answered piece by piece, as they always have been in technology. You know, I want to spend a second and say thank you to everyone at ASMP and the ASMP Academy, and of course to our friends and partners over at PetaPixel who provide and write these incredible stories each and every week, each and every day. And each week I will come back and pick 3 to 5 of them that I think are particularly relevant for this audience. If you have anything you'd like to see, please don't hesitate to write us over at academy@asmp.org, and definitely visit the Academy, academy.asmp.org. You'll find links there to everything we talked about today, a lot of other information. And I really appreciate you taking a look at this video today. We'll be back next week with a whole new slate of stories. For now, I'm Tom Madry. We'll talk soon.